sometimes you want a block of code to continually execute while a condition is true. So for example, you want to keep pinging a website for information until you actually get a response back. So while you haven't heard a response, go ahead and keep asking the website for information. Or maybe you want to keep checking in with a user inside your application until the user responds. So you could say, while I haven't heard anything back from the user, keep asking the user for some sort of input. Now, there's two variations of while loops that allow us to solve those sort of problems. There is the while loop that evaluates the condition before the loop, which is the standard while loop, and then there's the do while loop. The do while loop evaluates the condition after the loop. So it's going to do your code first while it checks a condition after that particular block of code is then executing. Let's take a look at the syntax. It's going to look a lot like the other control flow statements we saw, like if else and for. So here, I can see a standard while loop. In fact, let's take a look at what's going on. I assigned a variable called I equal to 0. Now, while I is less than 5, I will go ahead and print the current value of I is. So in the first execution, the current value of I is 0. Then using I++, I can add 1 to I. So now that I is equal to 1, I check the condition. That's still true, so I keep going. And I keep adding I plus 1 over and over again with that reassignment. And eventually, I is no longer less than 5, so that's why the loop stops executing with current value of I is 4. Now, here's something to make sure that you understand. This condition is checked before this block of code is executed. Now, if you want it to work the other way, you can use a do while loop. So here we first do the execution of this block of code, and then we check the while condition to decide if we're still going to go back and do that block of code. So notice the braces here, you're going to do this block of code while this ends up being true. So for this particular example, we actually made sure it would match the results of the previous one. But if you're actually wondering what's the difference between them, let's dive a little deeper. So it looked like those same methods, or those different methods, produce the same result. So what gives? Well, in those particular examples, the order of the execution versus the condition evaluation didn't make a difference. But I want to show you a very clear example that shows the difference between a while loop and a do while loop structure. So let's imagine that you have this code. Let's take a closer look. Here, I'm assigning the integer x to be equal to 6. Then I print a statement before the loop. Then I have the while loop. While x is less than or equal to 5, I'm going to print while loop and then the value of x and then say x plus plus. So what's going on here? Then I'm going to print after while loop. So I have x is equal to 6, which means this is not true, so we skip the entire while loop, and so I print after while loop. So we don't see any code inside this while loop actually be executed, because that condition was never true, and I check that condition before I run this block of code. Remember, the do while loop is going to do or execute the block of code before it ends up checking while the statement is true. So let's set the same situation, x is equal to 6, so in theory it shouldn't trigger the condition to be true. But now if we do while loop, notice how the structure changes the actual output here in the console. I have integer x is equal to 6. Then again, I'm printing before the do while loop. However, now I'm going to execute this block of code first and then check the while condition to be true. So that means that when x is equal to 6, I'll say, okay, go ahead and do this code. And then I'm going to check while this is true. That condition is no longer true, so I immediately jump down to after do while loop. The do while loop gives the condition here a chance to execute right after, or excuse me, right before you end up checking the condition on the while loop. So I think the naming scheme really helps here. It's the while loop that's going to, while a condition is true, that check happens, then execute the while loop. Do while is the opposite. You first do the execution while this is true. So I have them here, one on top of each other with the output of the console. I'd recommend you pause the screen right now and make sure you fully understand the difference between a while loop and a do while loop. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and explore more of this in Dartpad. Here I am back in Dartpad. Let's go ahead and first experiment with a very basic while loop. I'm going to have a variable x equal to 0, and then, whoops, make sure we end that line, and then I'm going to say while x is, let's say, less than 3, or 4 is fine, then I'm going to execute some block of code. And remember, I don't technically need to use that statement, so I can just print out, let's say, hello. Now, what I do need to make sure is not to run it right now, because this is going to execute an infinite loop, because I'm not actually changing x within my while block of code. So you want to make sure that this condition does break eventually. So I'm going to say x plus plus. So we go ahead and run, whoops, make sure we semicolon, go ahead and run that. And I should see hello printed out 4 times, because I have x is equal to 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, and then suddenly it's 4, and so this while loop ends up stopping. So I just want to show you there's different things you can do here. It doesn't need to just be, adding 1 to this variable. So let me just show you one more example. Let's imagine I have a list. So my variable is my list, and it's going to be equal to, let's say, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then what I could do is check while the length of my list is, let's say, greater than 1, then execute something. So now I'm kind of doing something a little more interesting here. I'm not just using an x that I keep adding to, instead I'm actually checking the length of my list. And what I'm going to do is, in this block of code, I'm going to keep removing items. So I'm going to say removing, and I'll just assign an item right now from the list. Then above this, let's say that my item variable is equal to, I'm going to grab my list, and then I'm going to figure out, well, how can I remove something? If I keep looking here, you'll notice there's a bunch of different ways you can remove something, and one of them is you can remove the last. So we'll go ahead and run that, and then I'm going to put a semicolon here. Let's go ahead and check this, run that, and it's going to remove 4 from the list, which was the last item, then 3, then 2, then 1, and then suddenly my list length is no longer greater than 1, so it stops that right there. Okay, so that's another kind of just general example of the while loop. Now let's quickly show you the do while loop. So let's quickly work through an example of a do while loop. I'm going to say this variable x, and just to make it very obvious, I'm going to choose it as 0. Now, if I were to say while x is greater than 0, print, let's put it in a string, x is, and then I'm going to print out the value of x, and then I'll add 1 to x. Will this actually ever run? Well, x is equal to 0 right off the bat, right? 0 is not greater than 0. So when I run this, I don't see anything in the console. It's blank. And just to prove it to you, let's again print, just to make sure it's actually running, before while, and then I'm going to print this. Let's say this is after while, and make sure we put in the semicolons and execute that code. So now you'll notice when you run this, I see before while, I see after while, but this condition was never true, thus I check this before I execute that block of code. But now let's see the following do while statement. So I'm going to say do, and notice I immediately go into curly braces indicating a block of code, and we're going to print x is, and I will print out the current value of x. And then what I'm going to do after this is I will add 1 to x, and then let's get our while condition, and we are going to check while x is, let's say, less than 0. So something interesting is going to happen here, because pay attention. X is equal to 0, and then I execute this block of code. Is 0 less than 0? No. So this condition is false. However, I'm going to do this block of code while this condition is true, but I always do this first before I check the condition. So then when you run this, you'll notice before while, x is 0, and then after while. Okay, that's the main difference between while loop and do while loop. Let's go ahead and go to the next lecture. We'll test you with a quick exercise.